What are the ways by which we recognize each other, feel superior to each other, feel insecure about each other? Why are we so fascinated by, is that person Jewish or not?
That was Professor Naomi Seidman, interrogating a trend she has observed in both her research and her life around Jews' curiosity about each other, and especially about famous Jews. The famous Jew who brought her to this question? Sigmund Freud, perhaps the most famous Jew of his time. Seidman found herself drawn to his works and their Hebrew and Yiddish translations. Rather than asking what those translations might expose about Freud's Jewishness, she redirects the question: what might Freud's translations into Jewish languages reveal about their translators, their readers, and about the questions Jews ask about themselves? I'm Shana Hammerman, and this is Cite and Sound, the Stanford Jewish Studies podcast. Here we host conversations with scholars and artists as we explore Jewish scholarship, culture, and history. On today's episode, we welcome Jackman Humanities Professor and Director of the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto, Naomi Seidman, who joins PhD candidate in comparative literature Ariel Horowitz for a discussion about Jewish languages, Freud, and an enduring curiosity about famous Jews. And now, the conversation.
Naomi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. It's a very exciting opportunity to discuss the book, to discuss your work. And the origins of this book are somewhat unusual. You mentioned before a collection you started to collect and going around and collecting Hebrew and Yiddish translations of Freud, right? Can you say something about this collection? What exactly inspired you to start this collection?
I was in the book gallery in Jerusalem, and I just saw the Hebrew Totem and Taboo. And what struck me was that this was an old book. There are all these, Hebrew is unusual. It has generations of translations. We're already in the third generation of Freud translations. English, by contrast, is, maybe now we're finally in the third. And it was an old book, and I just was drawn to Freud in Hebrew. Then I was at the Yiddish Book Center, and it just occurred to me, look up Freud, and I see some Freud in Yiddish. And somehow I started collecting these books. And I didn't mention that because I was collecting these books, everyone in my family had presents for me for my birthdays and stuff like that. So I started getting all these Freud tchotchkes, too. And during the pandemic, normally I work in cafes. My office was out of bounds. My husband and housemate put together their heads and made me a little closet that was called the Freud closet. And it was just a place with all my Freud stuff. And I started collecting books about Freud, but all, thinking about his Jewishness. And it was just in a kind of obsession. I brought some of my books with me to Stanford today. And I loved traveling with them, and I loved owning them. And I had them for years before I could figure out what the project was. I just knew I wanted to write about them. I think what I say is that usually you have a project and then you get books in order to do the research. In this case, I had the books, and they were kind of justification for a research project that didn't yet exist. And at some point, I just started thinking that maybe the research project was my own love for these books, that on some level, this was about my attraction to these books. And then when I opened up the books, and at least some of them talk about Freud's feelings when he saw the Hebrew and Yiddish translations of his books. At least 3 of these books have introductions by Freud in which he talks about his feelings about these books. And I thought, there's a lot of feelings here. And what are those feelings? And Freud says he couldn't read the translations, and he couldn't read them, and I didn't read them because, for those of you who collect books, it's not always about reading the books. And
It's about having them.
Having them.
Yeah.
Having them. And so what is it about these books that's not, it's not the usual way of doing research. It's doing research through, I guess, a kind of effective connection that's somehow channeled through Jewish languages. How do Jewish languages function and mean otherwise than what the words mean in a dictionary sense? How do they mean? How do they connect us? What is it about Freud in Hebrew that I loved, and why? And then I started realizing it wasn't just me who had these feelings, that these feelings were everywhere in the history of the translation of Freud and the reception of Freud in Jewish languages. That somehow these were ways, forget the Oedipal complex, forget all that, ways for Jews to connect to a fascinating person who was also the most famous Jew in the world.
Right.
Him and Einstein.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
wasn't gonna write a book about
Right.
Einstein, Lord knows. That's beyond me.
Yeah. And so let's maybe return for a moment to these introductions. What does he say in these texts? And why is it important to him to write these texts, to introduce the readers of Hebrew and readers of
Yeah,
Yiddish with
yeah.
a particular special introduction?
I guess one thing I should say is that Freud was translated into Hebrew and Yiddish relatively late. So he had already been translated into English by the time he was translated into Hebrew and Yiddish, the same year, 1928, which tells you something about a sort of global Jewish culture. Before that, he had already been translated, I think, into 22 languages. So we have here a certain kind of, first of all, a late moment in the history of Freud reception, and also a moment in the history of Hebrew and Yiddish, where they would embrace Freud and the idea of we need Freud in these languages. And he talks about this moment a little bit in these introductions. He talks about the Hebrew revival. He's interested in it. And as opposed to maybe earlier in his life when Yiddish was a little embarrassing or he wasn't that interested in it, he's caught up in this kind of nationalist moment, which was basically sweeping through Hebrew and Yiddish. And he recognizes himself as part of it. He's interested in the idea that his own words are going to be in one of these languages, which he calls it Yiddish, which he didn't have that word Yiddish in 1896 when he talks about jargon. He talked about jargon and he was kind of seemed like maybe he was a little embarrassed by it in the earlier years. But now the idea that Yiddish, he could somehow speak directly in some way to Yiddish readers through this language was very appealing to him. And he also talks about himself as moved by the look of, I mean, what unites Hebrew and Yiddish is the Hebrew alphabet. So maybe he couldn't read. He says he can't read them. He feels bad that he can't read them. And people always talk about Freud as being ashamed of his Jewishness, but it's very possible he was also ashamed of his lack of
Right.
Jewishness. So he feels something. He feels a whole bunch of things when he sees his own words in this language, which for him signifies all kinds of things. The language of his father, the ancestral language, the Jewish language. Um, and it's not that he thinks that suddenly he's going to become more Jewish. For him, it's very important to say that these languages are fully capable of embracing a new scientific spirit that is emblematized by psychoanalysis. It's not about ethnic narcissism, it's about science. I mean, he says that. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about these introductions that he writes to especially the Hebrew books, he writes an introduction to two books that are translated into Hebrew by the same translator, Yehuda Devere Devosis. And he writes in both of them that among the most intimate things he ever said, the intimate and direct things he said about being Jewish. And one of the very striking things he says is he starts through negation, which of course is a psychoanalytic principle. I'm not religious, I'm not a nationalist, and yet the deepest part of me is Jewish, and I don't know how to say what that is, and someday science, for him the greatest value, will understand it. So he says that, and he says something very similar in Yiddish. Freud's introduction to the Hebrew translations get canonized in the Standard Edition. The ones in Yiddish are kind of my personal discovery. They're not well known and they haven't been translated. And you can do kind of close readings of how they're different. I mean, for one thing, one is an introduction, and one is a letter that says, sorry, I'm not writing you an introduction, that they used as an introduction, more negations. But in both of them, he says how moved he is to see his works in these languages. So part of what I wanted to do is resist playing the usual game of catching Freud being more Jewish than will admit to being, and figure out what these emotions are that are shared by me and by Freud, if I can say that.
It's interesting the way we have on the one hand a moment for Freud, right, connecting himself to his origins in a way, but also an important moment for both of these languages, right? They are now able to receive or to describe
Yes.
this new science of psychoanalysis. You said before that the translators feel, it's a paraphrase of maybe what they felt. We need Freud now. Let's talk for a moment about these translators. What motivates them? How do they get to Freud, and why do they even want to produce these translators?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in 1928, the same book by Freud gets translated into Hebrew and Yiddish. It's group psychology and the individual ego. So Freud's works can be divided roughly into two big baskets, and they can be called sort of the more psychological understandings of the id, the ego. Those things are very relevant to professional psychoanalysts or psychologists. And then there are the more, let's call them the humanities books. So his writings about religion or his writings about culture or art. And those were the ones that were of greater interest. I mean, group psychology has something to say also psychoanalytically. I mean, they all do. But it speaks about social currents that were very relevant to the Jewish community, things like collectivity, the military, the church. I mean, these are Freud's big examples. Jews are worried about the military and the church for good reason. And they're also thinking about what collectivity is. So that probably explains why those books. And they were of particular interest. The kibbutz movement was among those who were very interested in Freud's ideas. They spoke about creating childhoods among, like, basically Jewish childhoods that knew not Oedipus, like ways of reorganizing society that were not based on this intense nuclear family dynamic. So the kibbutz movement was interested in the case of Weinreich, and in the case of Yivo, Freud was translated in 1928 by Sarah Lerman, which is actually a pseudonym for a male translator. I have yet to figure out who that male translator is. He describes himself, he signs himself as the translator, even though his name is Sarah Lerman. In other words, not
Right,
the feminine
masculine,
form, the
yes.
masculine form. So I know it was and he translated Marx, and so this is part of a kind of leftist, progressive Jewish interest. Sometimes it's called Freudo-Marxism. So in Yiddish, he belonged to that whole thing, Bakunin, so anarchism. So Freud sort of fit in some part. Some people considered Freud too bourgeois, but the sort of the Yiddish speakers and some of the, Max Eitingen, who started a free clinic, a free psychoanalytic clinic in Berlin.
And then
Some of them,
Palestine too. And then he went to
and then in
Palestine, right.
Palestine, or at least sliding scale, and they gave lunch. So in some of these places, psychoanalysis was linked to a leftist socialist agenda and anti-religious, secularist. So those are the people who tended to be interested in Freud in the Yiddish realm. And really, it's people translating Freud among others. It wasn't until the mid-1930s that you get Freud's authorized Yiddish translator who devotes himself basically to psychoanalysis as the major way to understand Jewishness, Jewish youth, etc. And you get a full-blown, I don't know what to call it, Yiddish psychoanalysis.
Why, just to go back to the first Yiddish translation, why would the translator disguise himself as a woman?
So this is something that's very common in the Yiddish press. Max Weinreich himself, like, not in his Freud translations, because those were the things he wanted to do, and he was proud to affix his name to them. But lots of people in the Yiddish press took Yiddish pseudonyms, like Yitzhak Bashevis. Bashevis is
The son of
Basheva's.
Bathsheba, yeah.
So it's not quite a female pseudonym, but it's a linkage to. There's a lot of reasons for it, and it was so common that when a woman did publish something, it was suspected of being by a man, especially if it was good. It must have been a man. So there's a book about it by Ayelet Brin, or it's at least partly about it. So I don't which I haven't yet read, though I've heard her talk about, so I'm curious about that too, but I don't know that much more about it. It goes back to the 19th century. There were a lot of people who published under the name Sarah
Hmm.
Bastovim, so it was a literary style
Hmm.
and
So,
probably had different reasons at different times.
right. So, what happens to psychoanalysis when it is transformed and appears in a different language, and particularly in these two different languages? It's a general question, I
Yes,
know,
so
but
interesting. I mean,
yeah,
there's
but
2 ways of looking
mhm.
about it. There's 2 ways of answering that question is what happens to psychoanalysis as cultural institution, a method of understanding culture, and what happens to Freud's German writings? And which one do you want me to
If you
talk
can answer both, that'd be great.
So maybe I'll go to what happens to him in Jewish languages. It's so interesting. So basically there's minimalist and maximalist ways of reading Freud's Jewishness. And the minimalist way is Freud is happens to be Jewish, very acculturated Jew, suffered from anti-Semitism. Psychoanalysis is unfairly tarred as a Jewish science. That's I would say, a minimalist reading. The maximalist reading is a long list of books that have the maximalist reading. Freud is really channeling the rabbis. Freud is really he's Jewish through and through, and all his discoveries can be explained by recognizing either the deep Jewish character of them or, more structurally speaking, which becomes common in the 1990s, that because of who he is as a despised member of a despised minority, psychoanalysis comes out of that experience. Not the Talmud, but the experience of being a feminized male in Vienna. He projects, circumcision is seen as a kind of emasculation, and penis envy is basically a projection onto women. Woody Allen has whose name should not be mentioned, has that joke about how he's the only man who has penis envy. Basically, that's what they say about Freud too. So it's not only his
Yeah.
joke.
So it's like reducing the entirety of his oeuvre to Jewish terms,
I wouldn't
understanding it only in Jewish
say
terms.
I wouldn't say reducing
Hmm.
it, but channeling it through that understanding, and it's been a very productive exercise. So, what I found is when reading the earliest writings I could find on Freud in Yiddish, extended writings, not just the mention that it's his birthday. There's plenty of that in the Yiddish press because they needed they needed news about Jewish celebrities. But when somebody's really writing about psychoanalysis, I think I discovered the moment when minimalism turned into maximalism through Jewish languages. And it happens between, and I think, a 6-part series on psychoanalysis by this very interesting character named Avram Glicksman, a Hasidic Jew, goes to Central Europe, gets 3 degrees, rich Hasidic family, they're supporting him. He's called the eternal student among his friends. He collects degrees, including psychology, economics, and philosophy. He's in Central Europe for 19 years collecting degrees. I used to say I was a gradual student. He was an eternal student. His parents say, enough. We're pulling the plug. You have to make your own living. Goes back to Poland and starts giving lectures, which is a way to make a living, and writing about psychoanalysis. So he's the guy who introduces psychoanalysis to Poland. And it's perfectly timed. There's a Freud craze. Like, everybody's reading about Freud, and he becomes a star, except he's so dull that he's told he has to put some jokes in his lectures. So, which is easy to do with Freud.
And with Yiddish, right?
And with Yiddish, it's perfectly
Yeah.
placed. So, Glicksman is playing the minimalist game. He says until Freud came along, in the Jewish tradition, mental illness was understood to be demons or dibbuks, and now we have science. So it's a minimalist reading. There's no connection between, and Freud himself plays this game. It's minimal.
Right.
In the Bible, they thought that dreams predicted the future. They didn't understand that dreams were residues of the past. He distinguishes his own perspective from traditional Jewish perspectives. By the way, I'm not saying which is right.
Right.
Like, I don't wanna play the game of which is right. I
Yeah.
just wanna notice the game.
But this is also a vehicle of modernization and,
Yes.
showing that
Right,
Yiddish
we're
can also,
modern, we're
yeah,
modern. We can do
we can do
modern.
science.
We can do science, we can do modern. Glicksman is introducing, Freud in this way, and then he starts getting into Freudian terminology, and for whatever reason, he finds himself, like, drawn to or inevitably using the Hebraic component of Yiddish. So the word Trieb, in German, translated as instinct, but really drive, is the better translation as people look at the English translation of Freud describe. It's like a major concept in Freud, and he lands on Yetzer. So Yetzer is, which in some ways makes sense, but it also is a word with intense Jewish associations,
And religious overtones
religious
connected to
overtones.
sin, connected to all that.
Ki Yetzer Adam Ram Minu Rav. Yes, not original, but Minu Rav. The inclination of humans is evil from youth. And then the Talmud, Yetzer Hara, Yetzer Tov, and also the Talmud, like Yetzer Hara, the bad inclination. You'd think it would be so negative, but the rabbis say, if we didn't have the Yetzer Hara, no one would build a house, no one would marry. You wouldn't have eggs for your breakfast, I think, if I'm remembering
Right,
correctly.
exactly. The chickens, I think, had no
The
eggs or something.
chickens, if
Yeah.
we didn't have so there's something like a libido theory there, and it comes to Glicksman through the force of these associations. And then he starts talking. I mean, that's just one example. I mean, I'll give you one other example. There's a section in Psychopathology of Everyday Life, hugely popular book by Freud, also popular in Hebrew. Got reprinted numerous times, won prizes. There's a whole section that Freud has on breaking objects, family stuff. Freud had a lot of objects in his house, as we know. What does it mean when you break an object? You start reading that. I don't know if it's me or the translator. The whole thing is about Shvirat HaKelim,
Right, this Kabbalistic term,
the
the
breaking of
breaking
the
of the
vessels.
vessels, yes.
It's all over. It's all over Freud, the breaking of the vessels. Is it the translator projecting something onto Freud, or what is it about?
Right.
Where does it come from? It seems like it comes from the language itself. You do Freud in Hebrew and Yiddish. Another example in the introductory lectures, which are translated into both Hebrew and Yiddish in the 1930s for obvious reasons. Freud, he talks about a dream, and in the German, he says, the first line of the dream is, my uncle was smoking, although it was Shabbos, although it was Samstag, although it was Saturday. And in Hebrew and in Yiddish, it's although it was Shabbos,
Yes.
although it was Shabbat. And nothing further is needed. Like, we understand the although. But in the German, Freud goes into, like, well, you have to understand that my patient who had this dream came from an Orthodox family. And there's a long explanation, which is faithfully reproduced in the Hebrew and the Yiddish, but it's totally unnecessary. In other words, the Hebrew and the Yiddish actually do function like a lost original in that case. And translating the explanation is a kind of unnecessary literalism. So one of the things that happens is that, as Heidegger says, language speaks. Jewish languages speak a different kind of psychoanalysis. They resonate. It's interesting because everyone talks about the English translation of having used all these Latinate roots to make it sound scientific. So in the same way that they were reaching for Latin, the Freud's English-speaking acolytes, Ernest Jones and James Strachey and all those, they're reaching for, it's funny, they reach for the word id as opposed to s, or, ego as opposed to ich, which they don't do in Yiddish. They're already worried about the id and the yid, by the way. They talk about that.
Well, that's a Philip Roth sentence, putting the id back to the yid.
It's already discussed in the 1920s. We keep recycling the same joke, except it wasn't a joke for them. In the same way, there's a kind of reaching for Hebrew, or either you're actually translating it to Hebrew, or you're reaching for the Hebraic component of Yiddish, because you're dealing with science and you're looking for something that has a higher. And suddenly you find yourself within rabbinic anthropology or psychology.
I want to go back to the breaking of the vessels example because you talk about the translation, and it seems like you don't want to argue, or you're not arguing that this is something that actually is somewhere in Freud himself, in Freud's thought or psyche, some Jewish overtones of Kabbalistic thought. That's not the case, right?
What is the case, so that's not the case.
Okay.
I don't think that that's the case. But Freud's most extended example for breaking an object is himself breaking an object. And this is an interesting example. So Freud writes that his daughter got engaged and he found himself, the household was caught up in an epidemic of broken plates. Broken plate?
Yeah, it's a wedding.
Actually, the broken plate is the betrothal.
Right, before the wedding, yes.
And Freud just says this is obvious why this happened. The plate, or broken vessels, he says. The vessel is the vagina, whatever, Freud, what more right. But it's also, this is what Jews do at an engagement, not Freud, Lord knows. I mean, it's hard to believe he had a, Tanayim.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, maybe he did for his wedding, but his daughter certainly
right.
didn't. And then you read that Freud was very disappointed, not in psychopathology of everyday life, but in the biography and in the letters, you discover that Freud was really disappointed that his daughter was marrying a banker as opposed to his favorite student, Sándor Ferenczi, the Hungarian psychoanalyst.
Hmm.
Freud basically was mourning a lost Jewish tradition of marrying your daughter to the best learner in your yeshiva.
Right, yeah. Wow.
And he's breaking the plates as if he has any control over this. I mean, this is my interpretation. But in other words, there are Jewish things that come back. Is it Kabbalah? I kind of doubt it. But this is folk tradition that I think Freud comes very close to saying that the ways in which I I think we mourn something about modern ways of arranging marriage in which the parents don't get a say. There's a way in which it's hard for the parents when a child goes off on holiday and meets a banker, no less. I think he just found the banker, like, particularly offensive.
Yeah,
I mean, eventually he accepted his son-in-law, but he wrote to Sander Ferenczi on the day of the wedding, and he said, I've been mourning that it's not you. See,
yeah.
it's not so easy. And so basically Freud was a kind of Rosh Hashiva,
Hmm.
was the head of a yeshiva, but stymied from that. And the plate breaking was a way of enacting a traditional Jewish ritual, in my interpretation. But what comes out is the language, right? I don't know if that was intended by the translator. It's a kind of like unavoidable echo chamber, as Robert Alter says. You put yourself in Hebrew, and suddenly you can't avoid the long tradition.
Right, right.
And you've basically Judaized psychoanalysis, and it actually takes a intentional act to avoid doing it. And people do avoid doing it now. Ruth Ginsburg was a brilliant translator. She's translating Moses and Monotheism. You could see how it's very easy, which has all these biblical passages in it. And Freud is quoting from the Philipson Bible because he can't read Hebrew, which I believe. So it's very easy for a Hebrew translator to pull your Tanakh off the shelf where it's always there, and you just produce the Hebrew text that
Right.
he's translating, and
Yeah,
you reverse the Philipson translation, and you go back to the original. Freud didn't have it, but you do.
right.
And Ruth Ginsburg won't do it. She's like, Freud said Moses was an Egyptian. He himself was a kind of Egyptian. He didn't have Hebrew. It's not his native tongue. I'm going to translate the Philipson German. The Philipson Bible that Freud used, we're going to estrange in Hebrew. We're going to let you feel the Bible as something that's not your own property.
Interesting. So, on the topic of language, now going to Yiddish, actually, what is the similarities between Yiddish and German? Does that make the Yiddish translations, I don't know, more accessible, easier in a sense?
Yes.
What does that do?
So, I mean, it's super easy to translate German into Yiddish. And many, many words that are in German can just be you just put them in the Hebrew alphabet or you change them in very minor ways. And you do it quickly. And your translator gets published who gets paid by the word. Why not? You're basically moving between the easy German path and the necessity of creating a kind of distinctive Yiddish phrasing and then trying to figure out which one is better and better in what way. So I'll give you one example. So the word for the unconscious, unbewusst, unconscious, or bewusst, or bewusst, I guess it would be. You could say that in Yiddish very easily, and as a matter of fact, until Weinreich came along, people did. The only problem is that it's a what's called a false friend. It's interesting. That's such a loaded term, but it means things that you think you know because they sound just like another word in another language, whatever. Like if you translated marché in French into march in English, it would just be wrong.
Right.
So as it happens that unbewusst means not well known in the sense of not famous. Bewusst means famous. So, well-known person. It doesn't mean unconscious or conscious. And sometimes they went Hebraic because of that. And look, ich, es, I mean, those things were easy. Iberich. But for Weinreich, I think had a very clever solution to the problem of unbewusst and bewusst. And he refused to use those words. He used wissig and unwissig. So wissig is a kind of archaicism. It's still it was already an archaicism in the Yiddish of his time. And it means something like what Freud was getting at with the unconscious. And he introduced that as a kind of terminology and a terminological, except that he's doing it in the late 30s, and along comes the Holocaust, and there goes the whole, except in Argentina, where it continues alive and well. And we're back to unbewusst and bewusst.
Yeah.
It's that whole attempt to create a coherent Yiddish terminology for psychoanalysis, which Weinreich was hard at work on in the late 1930s, basically disappeared.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about the question of the Jewish Freud, and there have been written many books about this topic, and you intentionally want to do something else. What do we miss when we look for the Jewish Freud, or when we ask the question, is he Jewish enough? Is he not Jewish enough? What are we getting wrong by asking that question? What do you think is the right question?
Well, I mean, Derrida already talked about the aggressiveness of that. So he actually wrote a commentary in Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's Freud's Moses, where he says that that Yerushalmi brings Freud back to the covenant a second time. In other words, gives him a second circumcision, by which he means Judaizes him against his will. So he treats it as a kind of ethical violation, and I want to take that seriously. I mean, that's one problem, is that it's an ethical violation, right? Freud can't talk back. He's dead, just like an 8-day-old child can't resist the knife. There's something aggressive about it, and there's also something narcissistic about it, because it puts Freud as the great person who knows it all, right? Freud is the great sage of Vienna, and yet the Jewish studies scholar comes along and does a little digging in his footnotes, and suddenly we have some power over him. We can tell you something about Freud that all those psychoanalysts the world over, in English and French and Spanish, they don't know, because they don't have access to this part of Freud, because they don't know Hebrew and Yiddish. And if you know Hebrew and Yiddish, you can say something about Freud that other people can't. So it's a kind of power play. Freud talks about the kind of the Galicianer Jew as the schleppy guy who puts his feet up in the train. But there's also a certain kind of cultural capital that Jewish studies professors or Jews that know Hebrew or whatever have, that assimilated Jews don't have. So it's a kind of I think of it as a kind of game, an academic game, a social game, or whatever. Exposes the hidden Jew in Kafka and Proust. It's not just Freud. It's all the hidden Jews in Michael Landon, born Eugene Horowitz in Brooklyn. So it's a kind of game of exposure that has been played so repetitively for so many decades now that I wasn't saying it's wrong. I was just saying, what else can we do? And one of the other things we can do is to switch the focus. Instead of looking at Freud and whether he's concealing his Jewishness or not, what if you look at all these Jewish studies professors, including me, and say, what's in it for us? What do we get by cementing this connection with Freud?
It seems like a Freudian question too. I mean, it's a
Yes,
psychoanalytical endeavor as well.
yes, except that I'm prepared to also read it. I read it partly like a psychoanalytic Jewish question. It basically puts on the couch, what are the games Jews play with each other, including, let's call them academic games? What are the power plays? What are the what are the ways by which we recognize each other, feel superior to each other, feel insecure about each other? Why are we so fascinated by, is that person Jewish or not? Like, you can't live until you know. You got to get out your phone and check it, right? I mean, I have it as much as anyone. Maybe it's something that's fading away, but I don't think not. Like, you got to know if this person's Jewish. There's people on the streets going, "Are you Jewish?" It's a kind of, I don't know, Eliza Slavic calls it racial fever, right? This kind of curiosity Jews have and the pride you feel, great Jews, the coffee table books, famous Jews, right? It's an old, old story. And I mean, Weinreich actually analyzes it. We didn't talk about what psychoanalysis is in the Yiddish sphere, but he actually talks about this. He talks about, if you want to call it ethnic narcissism, part of part of the way Jews play this game is that you get points for finding a connection to an important Jew that everybody else has access to, right? Freud is everybody's great genius, but
But
we have
he's
a
actually
particular,
ours. He's
he's
actually ours.
ours.
He's ours.
He's ours.
Yeah.
He's deeply ours.
Right.
So you own that, and you feel pride that, oh, psychoanalysis. I know all this question of, like, is the Oedipus complex real or not? Who cares about any of that? All of that is moot. This is why I don't think it's so psychoanalytic. It's like the actual contents of psychoanalysis, they're a distraction from this game. Like, people say, oh, you really think penis envy is real? I'm like, I don't care about it's like, it's totally not about that for me. Like, why would people are like, "Oh, I'm not into Freud." You
So
get
what
that.
so what is it about?
It's about the Jewish game. It's about games Jews play,
Yeah.
social/academic. Because I think that the academic pretends not to be playing these social games. By social, I mean the way Jews identify themselves to each other in public, the way they hide, the way they don't hide, the way they project onto each other, the way they feel about seeing. That thing I feel when I see a chassid in the airport. Like, I just want him to know that I grew up chassid. Like, I
Yeah.
just want that.
We speak the same language, right? Yeah.
Like,
Mhm.
what is that crazy desire?
Mhm.
It's a kind of intersubjective Jewishness, and Freud felt it, and he talks about it. So it's like we're both playing it. I mean, he also got harassed by Jews. I mean, Jews nudged him like you wouldn't believe, like, "Do you know Hebrew? What's your Hebrew name? How much Yiddish you know?" I mean, he had a lot of it, but he also felt it. It was ambivalent for him.
But there's a way in which it becomes also kind of a loyalty test, right? How much Yiddish do you know? How much Hebrew do you know, right?
Right.
Are you Jewish enough? Are you not
Right.
not
Right.
enough
Right.
Jewish,
Right.
right?
What's really funny, like, one of the things I discovered by looking at this is that this whole game turns on a dime when it comes to Moses and monotheism. So everybody was like, "Oh, look at all this Jewishness and Freud. It's so great. It's so great, great." Then he actually writes a Jewish book that no one could deny is Jewish. And suddenly all you read in the papers is like, that Freud, he didn't know a word of Hebrew.
So you didn't pass the test.
He didn't pass the test. And also, suddenly he's playing on our turf. And there's no way we're buying it. So It was just almost unanimous, the bad reviews he got for Moses and monotheism, and the good reviews for everything else, as long as he doesn't touch the Jewish stuff. All the time they're like, "Oh, if Freud would only be a little bit more Jewish," and then he tries, and
Yeah. I want to ask you a final question, which we ask our guests in this on this podcast. And that is if you can choose a text from the world of Jewish studies which you think defines this moment. And I have a feeling that it's going to be a text that is not yet written, right?
well, I have one that I'm thinking of writing.
So please share with us.
So I wanna write a book or maybe a booklet, I don't know how long it is yet, on the phrase, "Lo tuchatz hager," be kind to the stranger, for you know the heart of the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I started thinking about this verse when I saw it in Hebrew on signs at a pro-immigration rally during the first Trump administration, and academic books take a long time to write, and now there's a second Trump administration. The only good thing about it is that I have another chance to write this book. So I'm thinking about this phrase and how it's history, like doing a translation history of it. Why do people hold up that sign in Hebrew? What does it mean to the people who hold up the sign? How do evangelical Christians deal with this phrase? How is it itself a translation, right? Because be kind to the stranger, for you are a stranger. The first stranger is the stranger who's not me, and the second stranger is the stranger that you were. So there's a weird, like, we may not know what the word stranger, ger, means, sojourner, alien, foreigner. There's a million translations for it. But what no translator can miss is that you have to translate it the same way when it's you and when it's someone else. So the us-them part gets neutralized in every possible language. It's as if the Bible becomes mistranslation proof through a translational act.
Hmm.
That's my kind of a central insight, and I want to see how that plays itself out in the reception of that verse in our very moment.
That sounds fascinating and very important for
I
this.
should write it quick.
Yes, please write it quick before there's a
3 more years, 3 more
exactly
years.
exactly. Professor Naomi Zadman, thank you very much. This was a pleasure.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
me.
Thank you.
Today's episode was produced by me, Shayna Hammerman, with help from Eva Clem. Sound editing and design by Romy Kiorian. Original music is by Jeremiah Lockwood. Cite and Sound is a production of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford.
Stanford University.